Dangerous evolution. Rugby has always been a physical sport. That's part of its identity, and it's part of what draws people to it in the first place. The problem isn't contact itself. The problem is what modern contact has become. If you go back 30 or 40 years, rugby players were undeniably tough, but they weren't built like today's athletes. Props weren't running sub-11 second 100 meters. Centers weren't the size of NFL linebackers while still moving like sprinters, and conditioning wasn't optimized to this extreme. The game was brutal, but it was slower, messier, and far less refined. Modern rugby is a completely different beast. Today's players are products of elite sports science. They are stronger, heavier, faster, and more explosive than any generation before them, and they're colliding at full speed, repeatedly, for 80 minutes. Every carry has the force of a mini car crash, and every tackle is essentially a physics experiment played out in real time. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The human brain has not evolved to withstand that kind of repeated trauma. For years, rugby treated head injuries as just another part of the game. You got your bell rung, you shook it off, and you carried on. That mindset didn't come from cruelty. It came from tradition, pride, and the belief that toughness was non-negotiable in rugby culture. Eventually, science caught up. We now know that repeated subconcussive impacts, not just full knockouts, can cause serious long-term brain damage. Memory loss, depression, personality changes, and early onset dementia are no longer rare or hypothetical outcomes. They're showing up again and again in retired players. When former internationals start saying they can't remember large parts of their careers, struggle to recognize old teammates, or openly admit they wouldn't let their own children play the sport, it hits differently. These aren't critics from the outside. These are people who loved rugby, who benefited from it, and who built their identities around it. When those people start issuing warnings, the message carries real weight. This is where the danger becomes most visible, not at the professional level, but at the grassroots. Parents today are far more informed than previous generations. They see the medical research, they hear the stories, and they watch lawsuits mount against governing bodies. When they look at rugby, many of them ask a simple question. Is this worth the risk? Compared to other sports, that question is hard to answer convincingly. Football, basketball, athletics, swimming, and even some combat sports often look safer by comparison. Rugby, on the other hand, still involves children learning to tackle with their heads inches away from knees and hips in a fast-moving game where mistakes are inevitable and consequences can be severe. Most parents don't protest or complain. They don't campaign against rugby or argue with coaches. They simply choose not to sign their kids up. And when that decision is made quietly, year after year, the damage isn't dramatic, but it's profound. To be fair, rugby has tried to respond. Lower tackle laws have been introduced. Head injury assessments have become more common. Sanctions are stricter and stand-down periods are longer. All of this is genuine progress, and it does make a difference. But to the outside world, rugby still looks like a sport constantly reacting to its own dangers rather than solving them. Every high-profile player collapse, every extended stoppage for medical checks, and every post-match debate dominated by red cards and head contact reinforces a simple message to non-fans. This game hurts people. Whether that perception is completely fair doesn't really matter. Perception shapes reality. Before we continue, pass a like and score subscribe, so you never miss out on any of our videos where we cover some of rugby's wildest moments. Broken foundations. Elite rugby only survives if grassroots rugby is healthy. World Cups, Six Nations, and international tours sit at the very top of the pyramid. But that pyramid is built on local clubs, school programs, youth leagues, volunteer coaches, and community pitches. Right now, that foundation is cracking. In many rugby-playing countries, youth participation isn't collapsing overnight, but it is steadily declining. Clubs that once fielded multiple age-grade teams now struggle to put together a single squad. Schools that once treated rugby as a major sport have downgraded it to an optional extracurricular activity or removed it entirely due to injury concerns and rising insurance costs. When participation numbers fall, the effects ripple outward. Training standards drop because squads are thinner. Competition quality suffers because there are fewer teams. Player development slows, and eventually talented athletes drift toward other sports where the pathways feel clearer, safer, and more stable. Rugby isn't losing young players because they hate the game. It is losing them because they have better options. Cost is another factor that quietly hurts the sport at grassroots level. Rugby is expensive. Local clubs need medical coverage, insurance, travel budgets, proper facilities, trained referees, and qualified coaches. For small community clubs, especially in working class or rural areas, those expenses stack up quickly. By comparison, sports like football require very little beyond a ball and a field. When funding is limited, rugby can start to feel like a luxury rather than a necessity. And once a club folds, it almost never comes back. There's also a growing volunteer problem that rarely gets talked about. Grassroots rugby survives on people giving up their time. Coaches, referees, organisers and parents who spend their weekends on muddy touchlines. That system only works when those people feel supported. As rules become more complex, injury risks increase, administrative demands grow, and abuse toward referees becomes more common. Volunteers burn out. When they leave, programs don't slowly decline, they collapse. And this is where the real danger lies. Grassroots decline doesn't immediately show up at the elite level. You still get competitive leagues, strong national teams, and packed stadiums for marquee events. But 5, 10, or 15 years down the line, the talent pool shrinks, depth disappears, and rebuilding becomes incredibly difficult. Once you lose a generation of players, you don't just replace it. Rugby is confusing. Rugby people don't always like hearing this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Rugby is hard to understand if you didn't grow up with it. That doesn't mean the game isn't beautiful or intelligent. It means the barrier to entry is high, and in today's entertainment landscape, that matters more than ever. If you watch rugby for the first time, chances are your experience goes something like this. The game looks intense, the collisions are massive, the crowd is loud, and then suddenly the referee blows the whistle. Everyone stops. The camera cuts to a ruck. The commentator starts explaining something about body position, release, entry angle, or sealing off. The replay runs 3 times, and you're still not entirely sure what went wrong. Now imagine that happening every few minutes. Even long-time fans will admit that officiating interpretations change from competition to competition, season to season, and sometimes even match to match. If people who love the sport argue constantly about the laws, it's unreasonable to expect casual viewers to keep up. That's the core issue. Rugby often demands that new fans already understand it before they're allowed to enjoy it. Compare that to sports with simpler visual logic. In football, you score goals. In basketball, you put the ball in the hoop. Fouls are usually obvious. The rules are intuitive, and even when you don't know every detail, you can still follow the story of the game. Rugby doesn't offer that same accessibility. Possession changes in ways that aren't always visually clear. Infractions often happen away from the ball. Entire sequences hinge on technical details that casual viewers don't see or understand. Instead of being drawn in, they feel excluded. In a different era, that complexity might not have mattered. People learned sports slowly, passed down through family and community. But today, sports are competing for attention against streaming platforms, social media, short-form content, and on-demand entertainment. If a viewer can't understand what's happening within a few minutes, they don't stay to figure it out. They just move on. This is especially damaging for rugby because the sport relies heavily on tradition. Many fans were introduced to the game through schools, clubs, or family connections. But as those pathways weaken, rugby needs to attract people who have no prior relationship with it. And right now, it struggles to do that. The result is a sport that feels like it's speaking its own language, slowly losing the ability to communicate with outsiders. Losing casual audience. Rugby still has passionate fans. The people who love the game really love it. They'll watch full matches, debate refereeing decisions, analyze breakdown efficiency, and argue about selection long after the final whistle. The problem isn't the hardcore audience. The problem is that rugby is losing everyone else. Casual fans are the lifeblood of modern sport. They don't watch every match, but they tune in for big games. They buy tickets occasionally, share highlights online, and bring new viewers into the fold. They're the difference between a sport that feels alive and one that feels insular. Rugby struggles to keep them. Matches can be stop-start, with momentum constantly interrupted by scrums, resets, penalties, and TMO reviews. Games that should feel intense and flowing instead stretch beyond 2 hours, with long pauses that drain energy from the spectacle. For dedicated fans, those moments are part of the game's texture. For casual viewers, they're a reason to lose interest. Technology was supposed to help, but in many ways, it's made things worse. The TMO has improved accuracy, but it has also slowed the game down and shifted attention away from players and onto officials. Instead of talking about great tries or moments of skill, post-match discussions often revolve around refereeing decisions. That's not a healthy place for a sport to be. In a media environment dominated by fast highlights, viral clips, and constant stimulation, rugby often feels slow and demanding. It asks viewers to be patient, attentive, and knowledgeable. That's a tough ask, when other sports package their drama into easily digestible moments designed for modern audiences. What makes this even more concerning is that casual fans are usually how sports grow. They're how kids get interested. They're how markets expand. They're how sponsors justify investment. When casual interest fades, everything downstream starts to weaken. Rugby still delivers incredible moments. The physicality, the skill, the emotional highs are all there. But too often, they're buried under layers of stoppages, explanations, and technicalities that only existing fans are willing to sit through. And when a sport becomes something you have to already love in order to enjoy, growth becomes almost impossible. Financial instability. When people hear that rugby is financially unstable, it can sound abstract, almost theoretical. But this isn't a hypothetical problem. It has real names, real teams, and real consequences that fans have already lived through. Take English club rugby as an example. In recent years, historic Premiership clubs like Wasps, Worcester Warriors, and London Irish didn't just struggle, they collapsed. These weren't small, obscure teams. Wasps were 6-time English champions with a proud European history. Worcester had a loyal fan base and a clear place in the rugby ecosystem. London Irish had been around for more than a century. All three vanished from the professional landscape. Players were suddenly unemployed. Staff lost jobs overnight. Academies shut down. Young players who had grown up dreaming of representing those clubs were left without a pathway. Entire communities lost their rugby identity in the space of weeks. And the most unsettling part, these collapses weren't caused by freak accidents. They were the result of years of overspending, thin margins, rising costs, and a system that simply couldn't sustain itself without constant financial injections. That story isn't limited to England. In France, despite the wealth of the top 14, many clubs rely heavily on wealthy owners to balance the books. When those owners lose interest or run into financial trouble, clubs are immediately at risk. In the Southern Hemisphere, unions like South Africa's have repeatedly had to cut costs, centralize contracts, and restructure competitions just to stay solvent. And it's exactly this financial pressure that has opened the door to projects like R360. On the surface, R360 looks like a solution: private investment, global stars, slick branding, shorter formats, and a version of rugby designed to be easier to sell. In a sport desperate for money, that kind of promise is hard to ignore. But R360 also highlights a deeper problem: rugby increasingly being shaped around commercial appeal rather than its existing fan base. The format isn't built around club identity, local rivalries, or long-term supporter loyalty. It's built to be fast, marketable, and easily packaged for broadcasters and sponsors. Star power takes precedence over community. Presentation starts to matter more than pathway. Rugby becomes content. For traditional fans, this doesn't feel like growth. It feels like displacement. Instead of fixing grassroots funding, stabilizing domestic leagues, or protecting clubs that already exist, projects like R360 can feel like rugby skipping over its structural problems and jumping straight to spectacle. It's rugby trying to reinvent itself for people who don't yet care, while quietly sidelining the people who already do. There's also a real concern about where attention and resources end up. When investment chases global entertainment value, priorities shift. Decisions are driven by what sells fastest, not what sustains the sport long term. Tradition becomes flexible, player welfare becomes negotiable, fans stop being participants in a culture and start being treated as an audience. For a sport like rugby, that's a dangerous trade-off. Rugby was never built on mass appeal. It was built on loyalty, locality, and emotional investment earned over time. When the sport starts reshaping itself purely to look more commercial, it risks losing the very identity that kept it alive through decades when it wasn't profitable. Stalled expansion. Rugby likes to present itself as a global game, but when you look at who actually competes at the top, the picture hasn't changed much in decades. At almost every World Cup, the list of genuine contenders is remarkably short. New Zealand, South Africa, England, France, and occasionally Ireland dominate the conversation. Other nations may produce memorable moments or surprise wins, but sustained competitiveness remains rare. This isn't because other countries lack interest or talent. It's because the structural gap is enormous. Take Japan as an example. Japan's rise didn't happen by accident. It was the result of decades of investment, corporate backing, player development, and a professional league that prioritized stability. Their performances in the 2015 and 2019 World Cups showed what's possible when a country commits fully to rugby. But Japan is the exception, not the rule. For many Tier 2 nations, the story is frustratingly similar. Promising generations emerge, upset bigger teams occasionally, and then stall. Without consistent high-level competition, strong domestic leagues leagues or financial backing progress plateaus. Look at countries like Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga. These nations produce world-class talent year after year, yet struggle to translate that into consistent international success. Their best players are often developed elsewhere, play for foreign clubs, and sometimes represent other countries entirely due to eligibility rules and financial necessity. That doesn't grow the global game, it exports talent. In emerging markets, rugby faces even steeper challenges. In the United States, rugby competes with American football, basketball, baseball, and hockey. In South America, football dominates cultural space. In Asia and Africa, cricket, football, and combat sports often take priority. Rugby enters these spaces asking for patience, physical commitment, and understanding of a complex rule set, while offering limited professional opportunities in return. That's a hard sell. World Rugby has tried to address this with expanded competitions, funding initiatives, and development programs, but progress is slow and sometimes feels cosmetic rather than transformative. Without regular exposure to top-tier opposition, emerging nations can't improve fast enough to capture sustained attention, and attention matters. Sports grow when people believe their team can realistically compete. When outcomes feel predetermined, interest fades. That's one of rugby's biggest obstacles on the global stage. Too often, fans tune in already knowing who's supposed to win. Until rugby finds a way to create genuine competitive balance, deeper professional pathways, and consistent investment beyond its traditional strongholds, global growth will remain limited. And without global growth, rugby's ceiling stays low. But what is your opinion? Is rugby really dying, or is it going to make a comeback? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and turn on the notification bell so you're updated anytime we post new videos.